In this video, I'll be turning this boring glass box into a stunning jungle terrarium. Let's get straight into it. I'm using this small glass tank which I made myself from glass from picture frames. It's even got a hinged glass door which is held on by a bead of silicone. The first thing that I need to do is to add a drainage layer at the bottom of the tank. There's many things you can use for this, such as leaker, some cheap pea gravel, or even some coarse filter foam. All of these will work great, but for today's build I'm going to use some fine gravel. In case you didn't know, the purpose of a drainage layer is to act as a place for excess water to sit instead of it sitting in the substrate. If the excess water was to sit in the substrate with nowhere to drain to, it would quickly stagnate and lead to the end of the terrarium's life. You can get away without a drainage layer in smaller terrariums, but for a size like this, I always like to put one in. As you can see, it really doesn't need to be too deep for a terrarium like this, but just make sure it's nice and flat with no high or low points. Next to go in is a substrate barrier. The purpose of this is to prevent the substrate from getting down into the drainage layer. Now, as I used fine gravel for the drainage, I could have probably got away without a substrate barrier, as the substrate would have a hard time getting through the small holes between the gravel as it is. I did have some to hand, however, so I thought I may as well use it. Next up is the terrarium substrate. This is the lifeline of a terrarium's health, so it's important that you use a quality mix. I'll put the mix I use up on screen now in case you want to try making it yourself. I'll also leave links to all the components in the description below. This mix is great at holding moisture while still providing nutrients for the plants and allowing water to freely pass through. At the moment, I'm only pouring in a thin layer and then gently patting it down into place. I'll be adding more later, but for now I'm going to start working on the hardscape. I've got a good number of these stunning dragon stones which I think will be perfect for this build. Each piece has got some really nice detail and they've got some amazing colours to them as well. I say this all the time, but be sure to experiment with multiple different layouts and structures before you settle on one. This terrarium is very hardscape focused, so it's important that I come up with a layout that I'm happy with. Oftentimes you're going to have to use multiple pieces to lean and stack up against one another to come up with the layout you're looking for. In this terrarium that's certainly the case, and here's what I've come up with. I think I've created a nice foundation now which can be built on more shortly. One thing that needs to be done first is to lock all the rocks together. As you may have guessed, I'm going to do this using the super glue and tissue method. I'm simply tearing off a small piece of tissue, wedging it in between the rocks and then soaking it in super glue. It dries in no time and forms a strong bond which is 100% terrarium safe. Now I'm going to go ahead and repeat the same process for the rest of the dragonstone. After joining all the rocks together, you can see that there's quite a few white glue marks. I'm not worried about these as they'll be easy to cover with moss and plants later. What I'm going to do now is add some more substrate into the terrarium, mainly towards the back. I'm then going to use this terrarium tool, which is simply a stick with a cork in the end, to gently pat it down. Now you can see there's a much thicker layer of substrate at the back which some plants will be going in later. As I mentioned at the start, this is going to be a jungle terrarium and some spiderwood always helps bring out a jungle look. I've already experimented with some layouts off camera so I know roughly where I want to place them. As I go, I'm going to secure the spiderwood to the dragonstone with the same method I used before. If you're enjoying this build so far or finding it useful, be sure to drop it a like as it does really help. Here's the hardscape done for now. I'll be adding some more spiderwood towards the end to add even more detail. I'm really liking how it's looking so far, but it's about to get 100 times better as it's time to add the moss. The species I'm going to use for this terrarium is Fern moss. In my opinion, it's got to be one of the best mosses to use when making a jungle terrarium due to its wild fern-like appearance. To plant it, all I'm doing is tearing it up into smaller, more manageable chunks and then placing it on top of the substrate. I then gently press it down onto the substrate to help it wick up moisture and keep it growing strong. I'm really liking how it's looking, but I think it will look even better with some moss on top of the dragonstone. In case you didn't know, I do have an ebook which contains everything you need to know about making and keeping long-lasting, successful terrariums. It's absolutely packed with useful information and it's perfect for beginners. If you're interested, it'll be at the top of the description and in the pinned comment. Before moving on, I'm going to give the moss a light spray to keep it from drying out. Now it's time to add some plants. I'm going to be using a variety of plants that all range in different leaf shape, size, texture and colour. A wide variety of plants is always one of the best ways of creating a natural looking ecosystem. The first plant I'm using is Trident Fern. You may already know, but it is an aquatic plant that does grow great in terrarium conditions. One important thing to note is that it is an epiphyte and should not be planted into the substrate. I'm just wedging it behind the rocks. This here is a nano paludarium I made a few months back. It's getting quite overgrown, so I'm going to take some cuttings and use them for this build. A good thing about having multiple ecosystems up and running is that you can almost get a constant supply of free plants. This tank definitely needs a trim back, and I need some plants for this new build, so it's a win-win situation. When taking cuttings, it's as simple as going in with some scissors and cutting away. The plants I cut will grow back in no time, and once again they can then be used for another setup. Now I've got some cuttings, let's start planting them inside the tank. I'm planting these ones towards the back, and I'm using some long tweezers just to plant their stem into the substrate. I'll put a link to some terrarium tools in the description, as they do come in really handy along with all the other materials I've used for this build. Next I'm planting these hygrophila cuttings, which don't actually have any roots at the moment, but due to the high humidity of the terrarium they'll send out new roots in no time. The planting's looking good so far, but there's plenty more to come. Next up I've got a few different Bucephalandra species which I think would add some nice detail inside the tank. I've also got some small crypts which I think will look nice growing throughout the moss. To plant the Bucephalandra, I just simply wedge it in between the rocks. You can use some super glue if needed, but in this case it wasn't necessary. To plant the crypt, I use some tweezers to dig a small hole through the moss into the substrate and then plant it inside. I'm loving how it's looking so far, but I do feel like it's lacking some detail, so let's address that before getting any more plants in. I've got some small pieces of dragonstone which I'm going to place throughout the foreground to create a more natural transition from the front up to the bigger rocks. When building a terrarium like this, it's always important to give the moss and plants a light spray down every now and then to stop them from drying out. This certainly wouldn't be a jungle terrarium without some Ficus quercifola, and I've also got some Peperomia emarginella as well. These small climbing plants will add to the variety of leaves and textures throughout the tank. With the planting complete, I now want to take this terrarium to the next level by adding some small spiderwood branches. Adding small sticks and twigs like these is an easy way of achieving an amazing level of detail inside your terrarium. As you can see, it really does look a lot better with the spiderwood in. Because I used a lot of wood inside this terrarium, there's a high chance there's going to be a mould outbreak. That's where these tiny bugs come in really handy. These are springtails. They'll eat things like mould and decaying matter throughout the terrarium. They process this food and then poop it out in the form of fertiliser for the moss and plants. In return, the moss and plants provide sufficient oxygen for them to survive even in a fully sealed terrarium. They truly are the perfect inhabitant for these tiny ecosystems. The next thing to do is to give the entire terrarium a good spray down. It's very important not to overwater the terrarium and only water until the substrate is damp but not wet or soggy. I'm really happy with how this terrarium's turned out, and I absolutely love the huge variety of plants that I've used, and I think they all come together to create a really natural looking junglescape. One thing I know for sure is that it's only going to look better as it grows and evolves. As always, thank you for making it to the end of the video. If you enjoyed this build, be sure to check out this one, as I think you'll enjoy it too.